This video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Science, Unit 6, Coaching for Performance and Fitness. Specifically, it's looking at A1 skills for being an effective coach. So the spec for this whole A1 section kind of can be broken down to three subtopics. So I've color coded those. This video is specifically going to be on the skills aspect of a coach, which is the red content here. The blue stuff is all about knowledge, and the green stuff is all about planning for safety and changing conditions. Those two, the blue and the green, will come in separate videos. So this video is about A1, skills of an effective coach. Now, the assessment criteria for this assignment requires you to describe, explain, and analyze the skills associated with being an effective coach for performance and fitness. For each of these terms or each skill, essentially what you need to do is give some kind of formal cited definition. Textbooks are a good place to give definitions. Some of the websites you might find online are not perhaps as credible, so where possible use your textbook, but ultimately you need to evidence whose definition you're using and describe what is meant by each of the skills. Then give some of the other characteristics associated with this skill, linking them always as much as possible to sporting examples. Demonstrate your understanding of what each skill means through an example, ideally from your own coaching experience. Given the context of this assignment is you applying for a job, a coaching job, you've got to show that you've had experience of certain things, can recognize certain things, and can give specific examples as much as possible. In terms of analysis, kind of what you're doing is saying, if a coach demonstrates or uses this particular skill in this context, there may be positive consequences, there may be a positive impact. What's good about a coach having or using this particular skill? And in contrast, you'll also be saying, without this skill, or if they don't use this skill, demonstrate this skill effectively, there may be negative consequences on performance progress, performance psychology, performance confidence, the dynamics of their coaching session. And again, all of this through example shows analysis. So essentially, for all of the aspects of this part of the assignment, give a clear definition and description of what it is. Develop your description using sports examples to illustrate in detail what is meant by this skill, why, if it's done and used effectively by coaches in certain contexts, is it effective? If it's not used effectively or done, why might it have negative consequences, and what are the impacts of its use? So whilst this video is going to focus on the skills of an effective coach, this approach would apply to all topics within 6.1. So the first skill listed on the spec is rapport. Now, this isn't a cited definition from a textbook. This is probably from an internet source. You use the textbook's one as much as possible. But rapport basically means, what dynamic do you have with your players as a coach or your athlete as a coach? Is it harmonious? Is it positive? Is there an affinity for each other? Do you like each other? Do you understand each other? Do you share, empathy with each other? So it really is about this dynamic between you and others. Could be the team, could be an individual athlete. Importantly, coaches might need to appreciate, how do you build rapport with athletes? So one way to demonstrate or build rapport is to actively listen to what they've got to say. Genuinely listen. A lot of the time, I'm afraid, life's quite frantic and we may not always listen. Let them speak. Give them eye contact, be attentive, use their name when you're interacting, ask follow-up questions so that you show that you're really trying to understand them. Show empathy. So again, this comes with interest, common ground, getting where they're coming from, getting their perspective, or at least explaining that you understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with what they're saying. Feeling understood is a really powerful concept. Be trustworthy and give them trust. You may have people tell you information. Make sure it's confidential, that they will understand that you are trustworthy. Be transparent. Be constructively honest. They don't want to just be fobbed off with fibs. If there's something that you need to tell them in terms of how to improve, present it in a positive way, but be quite honest, and they will learn to trust that. Be genuine and be consistent. So those are aspects, other characteristics that may help either build or demonstrate rapport between a coach and those they're coaching. If you don't have this, if you're particularly harsh, if you don't listen, if you don't explain, if you aren't trustworthy, 1 minute you're friendly, the next minute you're bawling at them, they will learn to disrespect you. There will not be rapport. They will not receive your information, and ultimately the relationship breaks down. And for lots of reasons, what you need to do is explain why that might be problematic. Rapport might not just be with athletes, it might be between parents, might be with other coaches, but it's a very, very central characteristic skill of being an effective coach. Another very, very central one in, again, all sorts of dynamics is communication. So communication might be your use of voice, what you say. It could be your choice of words, the content of what you say. Voice might be how you say it. But actually a lot of communication is body language as well. So I'm sure we've all said something when we're thinking something different, or maybe we're showing something different with our body language. And a coach needs to be mindful of those things. If you're leading your session and you've got your arms folded and a stern face, but you're saying, come on everybody, you're doing really well, and you look really bored, you've got mixed messages going on there. Again, you're probably familiar that communication can be verbal and non-verbal. So verbal might be face-to-face, might be over the phone to your players, might be over the phone to parents. It incorporates what we said before, voice, language. Nowadays it might be a video call or group chat. Non-verbal is very much your body language. It's how you're dressing, it's your facial expressions. It might be documents or letters that you give parents, and the tone of those matters hugely. It might be gestures. If you think about coaching pitch side, when you can't always talk one-to-one to players, we communicate loads by the physical movements, the physicality of our body language. It also involves listening, and I'd say that was a really important one. And nowadays, again, emails. Listening. You might have to listen to players' concerns or worries or their suggestions. Sometimes coaches can be know-it-alls and not be prepared to listen. Sometimes coaches can may be good at consoling players, or may tell them to brush it off and not listen to their upset. That's part of being a performer and part of being a coach. You might have to listen to questions from parents, obviously essential, especially if you're working with young children. And you might have to interact with and listen to coaches and other coaches or officials, and respond to that. When you're communicating verbally, you need to consider these things. What level of terminology do you use? Do you use physiological language, or do you have to simplify things for the people you're communicating with? Are you using appropriate volume? Is there environmental noise that you need to sort of work around? What tone or intonation? If you're monotone, you're the same note the whole time, and it can be very boring and monotonous. Whereas if you intonate, you can show lots of emotion and expression and excitement and positivity. Do you communicate once you've got your players' attention, or do you try and shout over them? How many coaching points do you give? If you're trying to teach a skill, if you give them 20 coaching points, it's going to be a bit overwhelming. Pick a few, make it really concise and memorable. Do you check for understanding? Do you ask them questions? What questions do you ask? Do you get feedback from your players? Do you give them feedback? And of course, sometimes your communication is absolutely essential, safety instruction or behavior management, if there's a large group, or if they're young, or if they're misbehaving. So communication can have lots of functions and be done in lots of different ways. Take a little look at the detail of that, but again, you're probably familiar with the different ways your body can communicate. Being open, being upright, being confident. You can show anxiety through how you're standing. So when you're coaching, it's important you're aware of the non-verbal messages you're conveying. So gestures, body language, facial expressions, making eye contact. Not being able to make eye contact is a suggestion that you're not feeling very confident. And as a coach, you're there to present as confident, even if inside you're not feeling that way. Use of whistles might be really appropriate, also might not be necessary. Do you communicate by images? Do you teach by images? Do you give, in a coaching session, them technical pictures to look at to try to help them? Do you show them video clips? That's all communication. So communication can be during, which means concurrent, or at the end of a particular performance or coaching episode. Hot and cold is a similar sort of way. Hot is immediate, cold is later. So it could even be the next day or the next training session. Hot is right there and then or right after your session. We know it can be verbal or non-verbal. You need to consider how much feedback you give, how often you give feedback. There's obviously a need for positive, constructive feedback. Constructive might be something that isn't going right that you're presenting in a constructive, positive way to move an athlete or a team forward. So it's important to address issues, but done in a constructive way. Think about giving feedback in terms of the volume, the clarity. Do you do it in a public place? Do you do it in front of the whole team or to the whole team? Do you give an individual team member feedback in front of everybody, or is it appropriate to take them aside to talk to them? It depends on who they are and what you're saying. So be mindful of where and how and who you give feedback. Sometimes feedback matters to the whole team. It's important everybody has the same message. Sometimes it's just specific to individual players. So this is simply an example of positive impact, negative impact, rather than all of it. You need to fill in the gaps and add to this. So if you're a good or a poor communicator as a coach, what's the positive impact of being a good communicator? Clear instructions for learning, safety instructions, behavior management, reinforcement, encouragement. What's the negative impact? Confusing instructions. If your group goes off and they really don't know what they're going to be doing, you haven't explained it very well. There may be a risk to safety if you're not giving clear, concise instructions. If there's a time limit on your communication, let's say a timeout in basketball, you've got to be very concise. If you waffle on, that's tactically poor. So you need to consider different scenarios, different sports contexts, training, competition, and give a sense and some examples of positive and negative impacts of communication, good or bad. So the third skill listed on your stack is diplomacy. Now, as a coach, you need to be diplomatic in many contexts. It might be that you need to be diplomatic with the opposition's coach or the opposition's players. It might be that you need to be diplomatic with the officials, and certainly you might need to be diplomatic with, in terms of players within, those that you coach or your team. So this definition over here comes from the blue textbook, Adams et al. 2016, and this is how you would cite the author, and this shows that there's multiple authors and the year that the book was published. So the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and tactful way. If you lack diplomacy, you might just go straight in and say, well, that was rubbish, you were rubbish, blah, blah, blah. That's going to have lots of really negative consequences for the performer or the team. In terms of being diplomatic, you'd need to find a more subtle way to convey your point, being sensitive and being aware of the emotional responses and of those you're talking to. So it requires you to listen to different perspectives. It could be that you've got to be diplomatic because some of your players are falling out in the team, and you need to listen to different parties and what they're saying, and then try and diplomatically mediate solution. It could be that you've got to step in and intervene because you're seeing somebody be mean to somebody else, or one of your players is being too aggressive on the pitch, and you need to assert diplomatically that that's not okay without winding them up or making things worse. And it will require things like rapport already. So it's easier to be diplomatic if you're presenting as an open, positive person and you've got good dynamics and good relationships with who you're working with. The benefit to some degree of this is the relationships, the mutual respect. Ultimately, there'll be positive outcomes, whatever the issue that you're being diplomatic over. They'll be attentive and listen to that and respond to that. better communication, and hopefully no bad feelings. So what you want to do is make your point without making further upset or further damage. And I guess linked to this is how you communicate, being diplomatic. If you've got to say that somebody's going to be dropped, let's say, from a squad or from a match, to play on the weekend, you need to do that in a diplomatic way. You might, for example, say aspects that are good about this player, then say, however, explain to them constructively your rationale and how maybe you can work with them to get better, and then finish on something positive. So being diplomatic isn't just being overly direct or a bit mean or a bit inconsiderate. It's about figuring out a tactful way to convey something or resolve something or sort something out without upsetting somebody further. So it might be apparent from this sort of image that the next skill is motivation. You as a coach, if you're really effective, you will be motivating and elicit positive drive from your athletes to improve themselves, to keep striving to get better. So excellence is a gradual result of always striving to do better. Even if you're successful, trying to strive better. If you're struggling and let's say you're losing games, positive attitude to strive and get better. And effective coach will build that in their players. If a player has no perceived confidence, competence, they don't think they're very good, they don't think that they as a player are valued in a team, if they feel like they've got no choice in their training sessions, it could be that they lack motivation altogether. That means they're amotivated, and an effective coach an ineffective coach will create this kind of motivation in players. We do not want this. It could be that the way the coach acts elicits negative motivation. And what that means is the person is motivated, but they're only motivated because they don't want to fail. They're frightened of failing. They don't want to be embarrassed. All the negative reasons to succeed or try, that's negative motivation. We don't want that really. We want positive motivation. So then what I suggest you do is you find a good definition of motivation. A lot of sports psychology textbooks will say that motivation is a drive to fulfill a need. We are driven to succeed, to play well, to improve, and that's really important. There could be a level of extrinsic motivation. So coaches may create situations where players want to do well or want to improve to get some kind of extrinsic reward. For example, get the praise of the coach, which actually can be powerful. It's not wrong, but it shouldn't be the dominant motivation. It could be that they're motivated to win the trophy, to win the title, to get recognition, to be top of the league. So these external incentives absolutely have a place in sport, and coaches can use them effectively, but need to use them with moderate use, appropriate use. Don't overuse them. If you give certificates out every week, then you devalue them. You also don't want your players just to want to win to get the trophy. You want them to train hard to get better for their own sake. So extrinsic rewards and motivation is important and very much inherent in our coaching, but should not be the main dominant driver for participants, and coaches need to create that environment. Now, this is the type of motivation that we want coaches to encourage in their players and build and teach in their players. We want players to want to try for their own sake, for the learning, for the enjoyment, to get better and master skills, to feel pride and satisfaction. You can lose really badly and still be really chuffed with how you played. We want them to be persistent even if they're losing or not playing particularly well, to keep getting up and trying harder and go again. We want them to set challenging goals and not be frightened of not succeeding every time. This is what effective coaches need to build into their player. And they build that by their attitudes and the behaviours that they demonstrate and what they reward. If you only reward the goal scorer, if you only praise the goal scorer, that's going to create a sort of a culture, a climate in your team. If you praise somebody's effort or how they've got back up and tried hard again, then you're creating a completely different kind of positive culture. So do take time. I'm not going to go through this particular slide. I want you to have a look at it. Positive, negative motivations, internal to do with the athlete and the love of what they're doing, external, driven by external things, and the potential outcomes of those 4 variables. Have a little look at that in your own time. Strategies to maintain motivation then. Being an effective coach means you've got to try and keep your players engaged, make your training sessions challenging but fun, vary the drills, provide progression, so give them differentiated skills that make them work at their own ability. We're always trying to challenge them a little bit more, but give them some success. Praise their effort, praise their progress. Give them constructive feedback and help them get better. Value everybody that you're coaching, not just maybe your more advanced players. Set them targets and help them achieve them. That's what gets players going, and that's what will maintain their motivation. So again, you need to analyse the impact of a coach being effective by being a good or poor motivator. Potentially, if the positive impact is that if players have lots of intrinsic motivation because the coach has built that in, then they will persist at task even when it's really challenging or tough, or they've had some failures, if you like. They'll keep trying. The negative impact of poor motivation is they might give up really quickly when it gets a bit tough. You can think of scenarios and examples where you can give more positive and negative impact examples. So the 5th and last skill that we need to analyse is organisation. Again, inherent in coaching, you need to be organised before, during your sessions and following your sessions. What sorts of things does a coach need to organise? When he's organising for a training session or even a fixture, and you need to be clear with the importance and what those sorts of things are. So let's have a look. It could be things like organising the facility itself. It might need booking. You might need to go and visit it to check what facilities are available. You might need to organise catering. You might need to make sure there's an appropriate equipment there. You might need to arrange officials if it's a fixture. You might need to make sure that there is insurance in place for you as a coach. Of course you would. That's a really important protective mechanism to have in place. It might be if you need to get your players to the facility, you've got to organise transport. Make sure directions and timings allow for you to get there in plenty of time. Make sure there's appropriate staffing if it's mixed, or if there's enough of you, if it's a large group. Make sure parents are informed or are there if need be. So again, even getting to and sorting out a space to perform, there's loads that you might have to organise as a coach. In terms of sessions, legal documents, things like consent forms from parents if they are young players, medical forms, emergency contact, registers, how many have you got, organising numbers. You could have 40 in the group, you could have 10. It matters what age or gender they are. Are they paying? Have you got to collect money? How are you going to account for that and check and evidence who's paid what? Have you got to make any selection for matches or positions? Have you got to organise your players by ability or by different groups? Attackers, defenders maybe. You've got to organise them and get their attention and make sure that they are attentive and on task. Of course, things like equipment, so documentation, you would need to do a risk assessment to make sure that everything is in place and nobody's going to be harmed. Have you got enough equipment? Do you need to adapt the equipment? Are there some less able players that might need a different size racket or different space or different equipment to use to make it easier for them? Have you got the kit? Is it clean? Have you got bibs? Have you got enough bibs? Have you got enough different colour bibs, cones, whatever you need to do? You've got to organise the transitions in your session from drill to drill. You might have a different setup for that drill to the next one. You've got to be mindful of time and organising the time in a session. There's loads that you need to be able to organise as an effective coach in your session. A lot of that will come from planning beforehand, and some of that comes from experience and confidence in a session should you need to change anything. So, as with all the skills, you've got to analyse the impact of an effective, well-organised coach versus an ineffective, poorly organised coach. Positive thing could be something like, if you're organised, your players are going to get the optimal experience. They're going to be participating from start to finish. They're going to be engaged and challenged. They're going to have a variety of activities and they'll be really motivated. Or if you're disorganised and your ages setting up a drill and there's a really bad transition to the next one where they're hanging around, they're going to disengage and you will lose them. And that has a really negative impact on their experience, their motivation, their progress. Please again fill in multiple other examples and context for this. And just finally there's the spec again. So we've gone through the 5 skills that are listed on your spec. You need to describe, explain them through a variety of sporting examples, and you need to analyse them in terms of the positive and negative impact that being an effective coach in these ways has on the performance and the progress of the athletes.